Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So it is election day in Britain. I love election days. So even in Richmond or in the States, I love election days. I love the smell of it. I love the atmosphere. I love looking at the poll results come in. Now, to be fair, more so when you have something invested. I want the guy to win, and you're there like, ugh. But even when I don't necessarily have anything invested in it, I like seeing the results come in. So, it is an election day in Britain. They're electing their local councils. I had to look that up to figure out what exactly that meant. It's something similar to our local government. Somewhat different, somewhat similar, but I guess that's the closest, the distinction or the closest idea that you can have, like city council or something to that effect. We have states, so states makes it a little bit more different, but still, nevertheless. It's election day. Now, Jeremy Corbyn on PMQs yesterday went out and gave this rousing, you can call it taking apart of Theresa May and the Tory government. He did an amazing job. He was fired up. I didn't understand it at the time that I was looking at it. I was like, why is he going through her litany of failure? It's like this. It was like one failure after the next, just over the top, complete failure of the Tory government after the next. And he listed them out, explaining her sins to the public itself. It was amazing. It was great. So, it's election day. Brits are out there voting right now. I'm going to show this. And then I'm going to just let it play through. I'm going to let Jeremy Corbyn make his case. I'm going to let Theresa give her defenses. And I will say happy day at the polls. Let's take a look.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to Michael Martin, former Labour MP for Glasgow Springburn and later Speaker of the House. He worked in the engineering industry in Glasgow. He was active in the then AUEW, and he and I first met when we were fellow organisers in the National Union of Public Employees in the 1970s, campaigning for decent public sector pay and a national minimum wage. Michael loved the community he represented, loved his family, and our deepest thoughts and sympathies go to him, his family, at this present time. Mr. Speaker, did the Prime Minister feel the slightest pang of guilt when the Home Secretary was forced to resign due to the failures of her predecessor?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that I think it might be helpful if
I know I said I wasn't going to interrupt. I'm sorry, but it needs to be very clear. He's making that slyly, that's somewhat of a joke, and that's somewhat dickish, because Theresa May herself was the previous Home Secretary. He's talking about her. He said, does it pain you any that the other person resigned for your failures? That's essentially what he's saying in that joke. Some people may not know that. That's the only reason I'm interrupting, but let's keep going. I think that's awesome and hilarious. So, he started us off.
I first update the House on the actions the government has taken and is continuing to take in relation to the Windrush. In relation to the Windrush generation, because my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will be addressing the House on this later today. We all share the ambition to make sure we do right by members of the Windrush generation, and that's why he will be announcing a package of measures to bring transparency on the issue, to make sure that the House is informed, to reassure members of this House, but more importantly, to reassure those people who have been directly affected. Speed is of the essence, and my right honourable friend will be commissioning a full review of lessons learned, independent oversight and external challenge, with the intention of reporting back to this House before we rise for the summer. And the review will have full access to all relevant information in the Home Office, including policy papers and casework decisions.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, this was a crisis made in the Home Office by successive Home Secretaries. And only a week ago today, the member for Hastings and Rye, then Home Secretary, was denying there were any targets in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee. On Monday, the Prime Minister told the media, when I was Home Secretary, yes, there were targets. One wonders why the Prime Minister didn't tell her Home Secretary about that. and the pain that's been caused to the Windrush generation needs to be resolved very rapidly and full compensation paid as quickly as it can be possibly done, and an understanding of the hurt that they feel. But this isn't the only failure of this government or the only failure of its policies. The government used to talk about a long-term economic plan. But now, Mr. Speaker, we're the slowest growing economy in the G7. The Chancellor, sitting 2 places along from her, told the House his view was positively tiggerish of the British economy. Yet it has the worst economic growth figures for 5 years. What plans does the government have to change course to ensure we do get economic growth?
First of all, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, on the Windrush generation, I was Home Secretary when some of these decisions were taken and mistakes were made about individual cases, and I've apologised for that. The former Home Secretary also apologised for that. The right honourable gentleman is right in saying these are decisions that have been taken under successive Home Secretaries, including under the last Labour government. And if he wants to talk about the economy, let's just see what we've seen in our economy in recent weeks. Day-to-day spending in surplus for the first time in 16 years. The lowest net borrowing in over a decade. Exports of goods and services at a record high. Employment at a record high, and real wages up. That's a Conservative government delivering an economy fit for the future.
Mr. Speaker, 4 facts about the economy. Mr. Speaker, more people in debt, more people using food banks, more people sleeping on our streets, and more children in poverty. And the consequences of decisions made by the Chancellor of the Exchequer are that the NHS is suffering the longest funding squeeze in history. It sent our health service into an all-year-round crisis. Will the Prime Minister apologise to NHS patients waiting longer than ever for the worst A&E waiting times on record?
I gave the right honourable gentleman some facts about the economy. I can give him some others. More people in work and actually fewer children in absolute poverty under this government. And when it comes to the National Health Service, since November, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has announced £10 billion extra for the National Health Service. But I have also said that we want to ensure that the National Health Service is able to operate on a long-term plan. That's why we are conducting a review to produce that long-term plan with sustainable multi-year funding. That's the sensible approach to take. Not just to say this is all about money, but to say how can we ensure that the NHS is the NHS that will deliver for people in the future. That's about funding. It's also about reforming the NHS to make sure patients get the right treatment.
Mr. Speaker, not only was March the worst month on record in A&E departments, it was also the worst month for cancelled operations. There are 100,000 vacancies for NHS staff, and the Prime Minister personally intervened to overrule the Health Secretary and the Home Secretary when they asked for a relaxation of visa rules in order to recruit staff to work in our NHS. But it's not just the NHS where the government is damaging our public services. In January, the Education Secretary promised that no school would see a cut in its funding. Last week, he was invited to repeat that pledge and refused. I wonder why. Will the Prime Minister now tell parents, teachers and students the truth, that the school's budget is in fact being cut in real terms all over the country?
No, the right honourable gentleman is wrong. What we are doing is ensuring that there is more money available to schools. We are ensuring that we are protecting that core budget because we want to ensure that every child, regardless of the background, gets the education that they need and the education that fulfills their potential. And that's why, once again, it's not just a question of the money you put in, it's about how you spend the money you are spending. And that's why I'm pleased to say that 1.9 million more children are in good or outstanding schools under this government, and education standards are going up under this government. That's more opportunities for our young people.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, it is quite astonishing that the Education Secretary has been corrected by the UK Statistics Authority. The IFS says that schools' budgets are being cut, and the Prime Minister still appears to be in denial. It's not just in NHS and education where this government is damaging our public services. Mr. Speaker, it is also about police budgets. The previous Home Secretary claimed there was no link between police numbers and serious violent crime, yet Home Office civil servants said there is a link. Who does the Prime Minister think is right?
Well, can I say, first of all, on the issue of crime and police budgets, of course, we are making available this year £450 million more for police forces across the country. We have been protecting police budgets, which is in direct contrast to what was suggested to me I should do by the former Shadow Home Secretary, the former Labour member, now the Mayor for Manchester, when he suggested 5 to 10% cuts could be given in police budgets. But can I also say to the right honourable gentleman that he talks about the issue of numbers and the relationship between police numbers and crime. His own shadow police minister has said in terms that there isn't that relationship between police funding and the number of crimes that take place. Once again, it's how we ensure we're dealing with these issues. It's ensuring that the police are able to deal with the challenges and crimes of today, and that's what we're doing with our serious violence strategy, with our National Crime Agency, taking action across the board to ensure that our police are able to keep people safe.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, our Shadow Police Minister was pointing out that there's been a £2.3 billion cut in police budgets in the last Parliament, and it's her government that is underfunding our police force. 21,000 police officers have lost their jobs since 2010. 6,700 police and community support officers lost their jobs. In the meantime, violent crime is rising, and sadly, there are deaths from knife crime on the streets of most cities, particularly in London. Mr. Speaker, the economy is slowing, homelessness is rising, more children are living in poverty, the Home Office in chaos, and the government making a complete shambles of the Brexit negotiations. They're damaging our NHS, damaging our children's schools, cutting police as crime scores. And, Mr. Speaker, they claim to be strong and stable. With council tax rising by more than 5% all over the country, isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, facing voters tomorrow, is that with the Tories, you pay more and you get less.
More funding going into the NHS, more funding going into our schools, more funding going into social care. But if he wants to talk about council tax and the impact of council tax on local residents, well, I suggest he goes to Hazelbourne Road in Clapham. On one side of the road, in a typical home, someone will pay nearly £1,400 in council tax. Now, that, of course, is in Labour-run Lambeth. On the other side of the road, someone in a typical home will pay just over £700 in council tax. That's in Conservative-run Wandsworth. No clearer example can there be that Conservative councils cost you less?
I have to be honest, I love these, man. I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. Love it like nobody's business. I love it too much. I sit here and watch this, and these two are going back and forth. And Jeremy Corbyn, when he's sitting down, if you look at him, he's laughing as he's sitting down. He's giving a smile. Now, there are two ways you can look at that. You can say these guys are actors, and they're putting on political theater when they're doing this, and they're not, there's nothing in them. Or you can say that this is an aspect of the job that they do. I think sometimes they're political actors. I think sometimes those things merge. I think this is one of those cases where those things kind of merge and converge. I think Corbyn cares deeply about these things. I think by the same token, he's in politics because he's a politician and he loves politics. And this is part of it. He hit her on one failure after the next. And the entirety of this thing was her explaining the failures. If we're having a conversation and you're stuck in the perspective of explaining your failures to me, that doesn't look good. That doesn't look good. In one of the cases, he says, he names the guy, and he said the guy was positively tiggerish about poor economic performance. That's awesome. Oh, that's awesome. So, Brits, you're going for your elections today. Have a great day voting. Have fun. You already know who I'm for. So, I don't know how that translates to each and every person in your districts and everything else in your councils. But what I would say is, vote for the person who you believe represents your interests. I don't care who it is. Vote for the person who you believe represents your interests. I think when you go from person to person to person, and you ask them, what do they want? Meaning, what do you want the world to look like? What do you think your society should be? And you go down issue by issue by issue. People are not as divided as they think they are. They get into these cultural cliques and everything else. But when you're going by the issues per se, people are not necessarily insane. And oftentimes, they are somewhat to the left. Maybe not as to the left as I would want them to be, but at the very least, if the world was to where people thought they, or at the very least, had an idea of where they wanted to be, I could make inroads a little bit further. So yeah, when I say vote for the person who you believe represents your interests, I say that knowing some people will vote, on the right and everything else. But I do that with the hopes that the majority of the people actually vote for the person who represents their interests. Because my assumption is that person, if it's really who they believe represents their interests, and it's not, I'm just voting for this person as a hedge against that other guy because I'm terrified of this guy. If it's none of that nonsense, I think the world will be a different place. Like, think of the situation in the United States if people voted for who they wanted. In the United States, for the last 20, 30 years, you just had people voting out of fear. It might have even been longer than that. I'm terrified of that guy, so I'm just going to vote for this guy. And the entirety of the political system has been skewed in that direction, where you will, for the least worst. Think about that. Your political system is literally for the least worst. The only candidates you really get are these kind of egomaniacs who are somewhat vulgar and repulsive, and who are only out for their interests or their corporate interests. Because at the end of the day, you vote for the person who's least worst. There's a boogeyman standing behind me. If you don't want to put me in that office, fine. This maniac is going to get the office. Do you really want this boogeyman to get the office? That guy never washes his hands. Do you really want that guy to get the office? That's our politics. All throughout the country, that's our politics. The reason why people were so hopped up when Sanders came, because that was the first time in God knows how long where they were like, oh my God, I get to vote for somebody who's real. Oh my God. When people voted for Obama the first time, they thought he was real. Second time, it wasn't hope and change anymore. It was something else. It was something else. It was like bitter and disillusioned. So yeah, guys, vote for the person who represents your interests. Whoever that is. If that's not Labor, if that's not some Green Party member, fair enough. Just have fun. Democracy in action. Alright, guys. Have a good day. Oh, if you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can support through Patreon. I gotta be honest, I hate doing that because it feels, I've always hated doing it. My wife started me doing this a while ago. She was like, hey, you probably really should say something at the very end of the video to tell people to subscribe. At this point, it's become almost automatic, so it's kind of this thing. Like, all right, at the end of the video, just say it. On some videos, I don't, because on some videos, I feel like It's kind of gross. And on this video, it's kind of one of those things. I feel like this is democracy in action. I feel like this is a big fucking deal. This political edifice that's not really real per se, but we exist and float in nonetheless. Where it's like we have this idea of it in our head, even though it doesn't really actually exist. Like the building of parliament and everything else. Those aren't the government. Those things can get blown up, but you still have a government. It's a conceptual idea. So a legal fiction of sorts. I love this idea of people engaged in that process. I love it. And so it feels, I guess, greasy to me. It feels off to me to do the hook at the very end, you know, Patreon or Super Cash or whatever else. That's why. That's the reason for the weirdness at the end of this video. Nevertheless, have fun, have a good day, and enjoy your voting. Thanks, guys.